Welcome to The Fair Share, a series where we have candid conversations about school funding in the South. I'm Juliana Hoover-Potash, your host, and this series is part of Southerners for Fair School Funding, an initiative powered by EdTrust-Tennessee to support advocates across the South building a movement to fairly fund every school. We have conversations with experts, advocates, and students to break down why fair funding matters and how we can work together to build a future where every student has what they need to succeed, both in the classroom and beyond. And today, we are kicking off the series with a conversation at the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, Tennessee. This is a place that embodies and documents the stories and struggles of people who have fought for justice and equity throughout history and into today. And we are so honored to be having this conversation with Dr. Russ Wigginton, who is the president of the museum and also a renowned leader in both civil rights history and education. Russ, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Honored to be here.
I also have with me Qubilah Huddleston, who is our policy lead for Equitable School Funding at EdTrust National Office in Washington, D.C.
Thanks for having me, Juliana.
Okay, so before we get into the conversation, I would love for each of you to just share a little bit of your why, for why you do the work that you do. You know, just a part of your story that has led you to the work you're doing today. So, Russ, could we start with you?
Sure. Every day I have the opportunity to stand on the courtyard and reflect on what happened April 4, 1968 at this esteemed institution. And the reason that's important is because I watch people of all ages, people of all races, ethnicities, people who worship differently, people who love across the spectrum, people who vote in different ways. But the common purpose is for them to come and honor and respect and recognize the comprehensive history of this country and an important leader in Dr. Martin Luther King. And in doing that, it reminds me, and hopefully reminds all of us, of the importance of civility and the humanity that all of us deserve and hold.
Qubilah, do you want to share a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up in the South, in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I had various educational experiences that I knew were wrong, but really didn't know why. And unfortunately, like 2 years after I graduated, my school was shut down. And that really sparked me to learn more about systems and how these systems allowed something like that to happen. I really just set out to understand more about how our policies work or don't work to support students like myself and my peers. And yeah, that led me to where I am today, to just be like a fierce advocate for educational equity.
Okay, before we get into our discussion, Russ, I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about the room we're sitting in right now, and just help us contextualize where we are in the museum.
We are sitting in a very powerful room, and it's powerful because it's in reference to Black Power. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which made it really crystal clear to the world that African Americans in particular in the South were willing to stand up and be challenging to the status quo. And just a reminder to the rest of the country and the world that voting was indeed a fundamental right for all citizens, and that by having the ability to vote meant that your citizenship was on par with everyone else's. And when you can vote, you can change school boards. You can change rules and regulations. You can challenge the status quo.
That is such important context, and this is such a fitting space to be having the conversation we're having today about school funding, because like you said, you know, everything is connected. And so this conversation is really about the ways that our history through the civil rights movement and beyond are connected to the fight for educational equity, how it always has been that way and how it continues to be that way. You know, we're just a couple rooms away from the Brown versus Board of Education exhibit in the museum. And you know, that landmark case was not only about desegregating schools, but also about the gaps in resources between black schools and white schools, particularly in the South at that time. And so, Russ, I wonder if you can comment a little bit about some of the specific policies or other parts of the historical context that led to that moment, that led to Brown v. Board and the fight for both funding equity and desegregation.
Absolutely. I wish I had a crystal ball so I could
Don't we all?
so I could make sure that everybody who, when they reference 1954, they understand that literally they need to go back about 25 years before 1954. And that the efforts of Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund were underway a full quarter of a century before that landmark case. And the reason that's important is because it will help all of us know that was not an episodic moment. It was a strategic, long, marathon-like drive for equality and subsequently equity. Recognition was essential from the very beginning. And so when you look at all of the cases that happened that they were learning from up until the case of 1954, it just gives you this inspirational sort of wherewithal to know that it was recognized that the vast inequities were fundamental to why people were relegated to the situations that they were. And so, for example, if you don't believe everyone has the ability or deserves or has the right to a respectable education, then you don't allocate resources for it. And that was a normalized component of our society. And so what 1954 actually did was just bring to the attention, hey folks, we aren't recognizing that these folks over here should have similar access, or dare I say equal access, as other folks, right? We didn't go that far, but it was a quantum leap into recognizing the legitimacy of a people who had been denied equality for so long.
And that's so apparent walking through the Brown v. Board exhibit here at the museum. You know, just walking through it, you're immediately struck by the statistics on the wall about the differences in teacher salary, funding for school buildings, capital expenses, and infrastructure. You know, the differences are so stark. And so, Qubilah, I would love it if you can comment a little bit about how does that show up today? You know, Brown v. Board, like you said, Russ, a quantum leap, but also it didn't go all the way. You know, and so we have a different legal infrastructure now, we have different policies now, but that's not to say that we have truly put the funding out in a way that's equitably accessible to everyone. So can you share a little bit about how we see those funding gaps and resource gaps in policy, trends, and data right now?
Absolutely. So I think the legacy of, that movement really manifests in what we see in school funding. We know that school funding is such a local community issue. And as a result of that, we see funding disparities between wealthy communities and communities with low incomes. We see disparities between communities serving primarily white students versus communities serving primarily Black students or other students of color. If you look at the data, we know that in the South in particular, we have a huge issue with teacher salaries and disparities, or our teachers in rural communities. We know that their salaries are often lower because of their tax base, right? They don't have the same tax base. And because so much of school funding is based off of local property taxes, those rural communities or those low-income communities, they simply cannot afford to provide their educators the salaries that I know they would like to, but because of the way the funding systems are structured, they're not able to do that. We also just generally see insufficient funding. Russ, you talked about equality. I think, EdTrust would say equal is not good enough, right? And we know that in certain communities, students have significantly more needs. And so when we look at state funding systems, some have made a lot of progress, but we also know that there's still so far to go in providing students with what they need.
100%. I kind of want to tie that thread to help us think a little bit outside the classroom too. We've talked about how the resource gaps have been there for decades and decades and decades. They look a little different now, but they're still there, right? And so can you all say a little bit about what underfunding in a school, what does that mean on a community level? It might mean you have, less pay for your teachers, but how does that spill out into our communities?
Well, the more things change, the more they remain the same. We talk about Brown as a important desegregation effort, which is different than integration. And again, go back to that crystal ball, and in 1954, I do wonder if we could ask society, is integration what we desire? I'm not sure anybody in society at large would have advocated for that across the spectrum. If equal funding was spread throughout the country, I think segregation would have been just fine to most people in society. And we have to deal with that fact. The reality of it is segregation is indeed still very much at play.
Yes.
School systems don't look much different than they did 70 years ago. And so what that means is how resources are allocated. Even if we want to talk about some of the social dimensions of what either desegregation or integration mean, when resources are not allocated appropriately, you're still going to land back at a intensely segregated society through the lens of education. And it's going to be social or economically based, which often translates into racially and ethnically based, right? And so what we can't do is disentangle the importance of the resources. It feels less personal, but it's still, the data proves that out. And so we have to be conscious of the fact that resources drive what happens in education. Last thing I'll say on that is, Thurgood Marshall was asked, how long do you think this full integration or desegregation would take now that the Brown decision has happened? And he was optimistic in that it would be less than a decade.
Wow.
Can you imagine? Now, this is somebody who had been on a marathon, who felt like essentially we were towards the end of that journey. I don't think he would be pleased that 70 years later, we are not that different from the standpoint of where people go to school, your ability to predict where they go to school based on economics.
Especially so since we're in this moment of, vouchers taking over, kind of from a policy perspective, and that being proposed as like a tool for equity by some. But we know that vouchers, were a response to the deseg order and certain communities wanting to undermine that and, taking public funds to fund, private education. And so you're absolutely right that we're pretty much still in the same space, but there is a lot of opportunity. And so speaking of opportunity, Russ, we just talked about this long and storied history of inequities in the South, but we also recognize that without, Southern progress, there is no national progress. And so why do you think the South is the place we should be making the case for more fair funding, and why right now?
That's a great question, and it's fascinating to think about the desegregation and integration journey that our country's been on, because what we tend not to do is spend enough time studying demographics in school. It's all about where people live. It's all about the racial, ethnic, economic breakdown of communities. And what we know, because of the history of our country, is people of color are fundamentally rooted in the South. They're rooted in the South because that's where their people were. And even if they migrated, we've also often overlooked the return to the South. And there's a return to the South because
Right.
that's where the roots are. If we really want this notion of education to really be a legitimate form of opportunity for everybody, we're going to have to listen with more care and have the courage to act in some compelling ways to give everybody a legitimate chance to reach their full potential.
I love that. And I want to circle back to that listening with intention and making sure that people have what they need. I also want to tap back on something that you said earlier, just about the demographics of the South. There's so many advocates and experts and think tanks and policy actors across the country who say that their mission is to support students and communities of color, students and communities from low-income backgrounds, and all of these underserved populations. And when we look at the demographics, right, we see that out of the whole population in the US, over half of Black students are in the South. A third of all public school students in the country go to school in the South. And another population that people may or may not think of is our really rapidly growing Latino student population, right? And so for folks in other parts of the country or national organizations who are interested in helping these students and communities and providing support, you can't escape the fact that the South is where these people are, right? And so that's part of the reason why, as Qubilah said, we really believe Southern progress is national progress, and this is where we need to start. And before we move on to talk more about, what is fair funding and why do we care about that specifically, Russ, I wonder if you could also comment on the legacy of civil rights activism in the South, particularly on education or literally done by students, and how that legacy might actually position Southern advocates to be the right people to do this kind of work.
Sure. What I would describe as the dirty little secret is that Southern society at large, in its entirety, has always and continues to trail in its educational accomplishments and achievements. And so think about that dynamic. Think about the fact that Southern states at large, regardless of how you might break students down socioeconomically or demographically, have always trailed Northern and Western counterparts. The fact remains, if you look at the states that struggle the most, there's significant Southern representation. And so you have to keep that premise in your mind. We're at large not where we need to be. And so when you think about that, despite that, the representation of historically Black colleges and universities, for example, which have been the impetus for So much of the civil human rights progress coming out of those institutions historically, coming all throughout these places, ironically, where education was considered in its weakest form. But that's where the student activism arose. That's where that keen intellect, that willingness to challenge authority, that desire for excellence, that ability and willingness to sacrifice, it comes from, rooted in those institutions. Until the southern part of the United States emphasizes a focus on measuring against the rest of the country instead of its surrounding citizens, the South will always struggle in its educational attainment, and it will also, which also means the unwillingness to take the monumental steps that are necessary for funding and resource allocation. Because as long as we're just doing a little bit better than our neighboring state, as long as that's a legitimate response, I don't know if we're going to climb that mountain that you all are talking about at EdTrust.
That is such a real and true point. And, that's that dynamic. We see it a lot in this funding work. When we talk about how much funding is enough, what do students really need to succeed, to thrive, oftentimes we see states benchmarking themselves against their neighbors, the folks that they see as their peers. And it really does bring out into focus this question of what do we mean by enough funding? What do we mean by fair funding? And so Qubilah, as our policy expert in this area, can you break down this concept of fair funding for K-12 schools, or what we might also call resource equity, in sort of for a non-policy audience? How would you break that down?
We know that certain students have additional barriers that they face through no fault of their own, right? By and large, where you're born and where you live is where you attend school. And so if you are living in a community that doesn't have a strong tax base, then your schools are likely going to be underfunded. And so when we think about fair funding, we're talking about districts who are serving mostly students of color or students who are multilingual learners, getting enough funding to meet those students' specific needs, right? So not the same, right, as a district who barely serves any students from low income background. We're talking about additional resources we know make a difference. I'm thinking about, like high impact tutoring, right? That was such a, highly talked about resource as a result of COVID, but districts can't offer high impact tutoring if they don't have sufficient funding.
Right.
And again, we also have to remember that while districts are making a lot of these decisions around which resources are going into which schools, the starting point of all of this is the state funding formula. And I mentioned that a lot of states have made progress to the point where they are providing additional funding, but we know it's not enough. And I just want to emphasize again, equal is not good enough. When we look at the research, some of the research suggests that, students need 2 to 3 times more resources or funding. Students from low income backgrounds or English learners, they need up to 2 to 3 times more funding. And I can tell you right now, there is no southern state that is providing that level of resources. Again, many have made progress, but we know, as Russ just explained, there's still a ton of more progress. For your average person, they can look at school facilities and see differences, right? Crumbling buildings, poorly designed playgrounds, right? Or look at the quality of teachers in schools. We know that in certain communities, there are more teachers that are just starting out versus having a teacher who's been doing, in the classroom for 10 to 15 years and really knows how to deliver the curriculum. There's really a number of different resources that matter for students, but when it comes to school funding, if the funding is not there, those students don't have access to those resources.
Right. Absolutely. And if I just try to boil that down,
It's a lot.
because we love details, but we also love a headline.
Yeah.
What we're saying is every student is different,
Yeah.
right? Every student is unique, and some students need additional support to be ready to learn. And so it's not to say that having enough funding is a magic wand that solves all of our educational equity problems, right? We know that it's not going to immediately fix anything, but we also know the things that these evidence-based practices and supports that definitely will help students. You need money to provide them,
Yeah.
right? We need this both enough money, and we need to be distributing that money to the places where students really need it.
Yeah.
Does that feel about right?
Yeah, I think that feels right.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to start wrapping up here. And so, Russ, I wonder if you can share a little bit about, we've talked about the context, historical context, why we think fair funding is important. We've talked about the history of the South. And Southern states are full of organizations, stakeholders, advocates who care about kids. They care about students and their futures and their communities. Can you talk a little bit about what role you think organizations like EdTrust-Tennessee or other advocates can be playing in this time to help get those resources to students?
We already have the answers for how students can thrive. It shows up in schools that that aren't limited by resources where they spend their money. And reading, writing, arithmetic is a part of it, but all those places that aren't shackled by insufficient resources have phenomenal arts and cultural spaces, don't they? Because they already recognize that the combination of all of that gets to your earlier point of recognizing the individuality and how different dimensions can light the fire, if you will, for students across all the spectrums. If we were to think about our system differently and think about the overall collective winning formula, if you will, I think we would be much more excited about investing more of our resources into the reading, writing, arithmetic at early ages, such that those other dimensions could come to life that we know are still so critical to one's learning. We've yet to reach that moment, and I think until we do so, we will not have reached the full potential of what the Brown decision was really trying to get at in 1954.
Absolutely.
I couldn't agree more, especially as someone who works on school funding policy. And, it's my job to understand how do states basically conceptualize what is enough funding to make sure our students succeed. And oftentimes it's rooted in academics, test scores. That is the currency. But at EdTrust, we think academics are important, but we also know it's important for students to see themselves in their educators, for them to see themselves in the curriculums. And so I think this is an opportunity, as we know many Southern states are evaluating their funding systems and thinking about how to improve resource equity, for them to think about some of those things that you just laid out, because if we don't, we're gonna miss an opportunity. This generation, they have things, they have access to things that we didn't. Why are we not thinking about that from a policy perspective and marrying that to how we allocate funding and resources to our schools?
Yes, I love that. And we know what some of the supports are that students need. We know what a thriving environment looks like. And one thing I'm taking away from what both of you said just now is that basically where we send our money shows our priorities, right? It's not that difficult to, we can follow the money and see what are our values. And so as communities in the South, people care about their schools, they care about education, and there's work that needs to be done to get the voices of those people up to the policymakers at the state level, who are mostly in charge of allocating and distributing the funding, right? So that communal vision we have of a thriving environment and a high quality education where every student has access, so that that can become more of a reality. And one thing that I'm thinking of is, Russ, you're so right that we have such a long way to go. And I also want to just tag on some things that we've been seeing recently in the policy space in the South. States are not putting enough funding towards schools, certainly, but some states are starting to reevaluate, like Qubilah said, how they allocate those dollars. And it's building momentum, regional momentum for change on this policy level, which is really what we're all about, is helping advocates drive that momentum and grow that momentum in their own state. So Tennessee has completely changed the way that we fund our K-12 public schools. Mississippi has completely changed the way they fund their public schools. Alabama policymakers are currently discussing if they want to follow suit. And there's conversations happening in other states around the South. So now is a good time for advocates and community members to get involved in this conversation.
As we're in this moment where there is a lot of uncertainty about the state of school finances because of various things that are outside of districts' control, and in some instances states' control, I really want to implore folks to think about what can you do to help make the case that fair funding is the way we need to go. We're really at risk of losing ground on a lot of the progress that we've made. And so I just want to encourage folks to really think about what is the role you can play in shifting that directory or impacting the directory of your local schools. And we're in this museum that archives so much of the history of children, teens, parents, educators, community leaders who asked themselves that question and took up that charge to fight and make a difference. And so I think this moment in time really calls for all of us to do that.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because there does seem to be this interesting moment where there is recognition that if we stay the course that we have been rigidly stuck to for so long, we aren't going to have people who are going to be able to serve in the professional and various jobs that are not just the future but that are here now. We aren't preparing students to be prepared for that world. We also aren't preparing them to be critical thinkers and citizens of the world. And I think we are getting the byproduct of not doing that prep work. So when young people don't know, what used to be considered very basic information about our own country, and we wave our finger at them, we're really doing that because we're unwilling to look in the mirror and wave our finger at ourselves.
That's right.
Because what we haven't done is prepared them to think about the world as it was, the world as it is, and the world as it's going to be.
And the world it could be.
And the world it could be. Thank you.
Russ, before we close out, I wonder if you could share a message that you think that the civil rights leaders who are documented in this museum, the activists, Dr. King himself, what any of these people might have said to advocates today, or parents today, or educators today about what they can be doing.
So one of the things we seek to capture in this museum is the importance of everyday people doing extraordinary things in their communities. That is really the legacy of the civil rights movement. There were leaders who emerged, and you're right, we document many of them and we lift them up and share their contributions to the world. But they were representatives of everyday people, putting one foot in front of the other and seizing moments that caught their spirit, that they said, this is where I draw the line. This is where I pay the price. This is where I make the sacrifice. This is where I challenge the status quo. And so the opportunity for everyone to find what that is for them. There are many areas, certainly in the short list has to be education. And when we do that, and we do that en masse, the power of potential is inspiring. And that is the history of the civil rights movement. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And that was the case then, and it's still the case today. It manifests a little differently today, but it's still very much the case today.
Russ, that is an incredible message to close out our conversation today. And just in the spirit of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, you know, I love that this has been not only a learning conversation, but also a call to action. So thank you both for being here and helping me learn, helping me grow, and just bringing out these key points about why we care about fair funding. And for anyone who is listening, thank you for joining us. If you are interested in learning more about how your state funds its school system and how your students are receiving resources, you can go to our website, which is www.fundsouthernschools.org, F-U-N-D, southernschools.org, to learn more. This is the beginning of a longer conversation that we'll be having. Next time, we'll be sitting down with student activists who are doing the work in their own southern states to push for fairer resources. So come back for that conversation and we'll keep our learning journey going. Thank you.